morning, everyone, and welcome to episode 127 of the Retrospectives podcast, Ghost Trick Phantom Detective. My name is Patrick Arthur, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, James Sterlings. James, this game that you've selected for the podcast was released in 2010. I thought we were meant to be a retro gaming podcast. Is 2010 really that retro?
No, not really, but I've been wanting to play this one since we started the show because I've read all over the internet and have had dozens of friends tell me that this is one of the best games they've ever played. So I don't care, we're doing it. We did it. It was great. Pretty excited for this episode, to be honest.
Yeah, we're just in Feb, and this game has just slipped into the 15-year-old rule. So James gets to pick a Nintendo DS game. It's very inappropriate of him, but I mean, technically it is 15 years old, so we're going to roll with it.
And to be fair, Patrick already picked a PS3 game when we did Chronicles of Riddick, Escape from Butcher Bay.
It's like
Isn't that right?
2007, 2008, right? See, it's completely fine, completely different. So I hadn't actually really heard of this game at all. Like I'd heard of it in the abstract, but I knew nothing about it coming in. So this was very blind for me. Did you know anything about this game other than it was widely celebrated?
I actually knew one of the plot twists from the end of the game that I was glad to find out didn't ultimately affect my enjoyment of it. And I knew that it was made by the team who made the first few Ace Attorney games, which to me, is a big selling point. I really like those games and the kind of like style and presentation that they've got going. So I hadn't really looked too closely into the actual gameplay, however, which I only did, the week before after I picked it. Because I generally like to go into something blind for the purposes of review.
And as we will be discussing, this is basically just another Ace Attorney game. So, I mean, a little different, obviously, but it's remarkable how similar it feels across the board. And it's always good to do puzzle games of the show because it's a genre that James and I are both big fans of. But the puzzle genre back in the day was very different to what it is now. So, for those who have never heard of us before, James and I are the Retrospectives podcast. What we do each and every episode is we play through a classic game of the past, and then we review it from a modern perspective. What that means is that we're not a historical podcast, we're not a nostalgia podcast, we're not trying to appreciate these games in the context in which they are released. We simply want to know how fun they are to play today, as if they had been released today amongst modern titles. While this is a harsh standard of criticism, we have found that just as often as these old games are complete stinkers, they are often quietly brilliant in the way that, and a lot of the design choices that might be considered obsolete actually have a lot of things going for them. And even the games that we don't enjoy for whatever reason still have aspects about them which show that old games still have a lot to offer and there's a lot to be learned from them. So Ghost Trick Phantom Detective. I think this is a game that needs a degree of explanation because I certainly didn't know what the game was and I didn't know what I was getting into. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a brief explanation about this game and then we'll get into discussing the aesthetics and story before returning to the gameplay in a far deeper dive.
Yeah, and I think the best place to start is probably on the game's original set of hardware. So this was a game that came out for the original Nintendo DS system.
Exclusively for the Nintendo DS.
Exclusively, and as such, much of the game's controls and the way it plays is in fact driven by, the choice of hardware. This is a primarily touch-driven game with a lot of clicking around on the screen. It actually isn't only locked to the DS anymore, right, Pat? So now you can actually get a new updated version on pretty much everything. I think it's on phone, PC,
PlayStation,
Switch,
Xbox,
etc. Yeah, because they re-released this as a remaster. I think it was last year or the year before. So there's a pretty big way to gain access to this one nowadays, which is nice. I personally actually went out and bought a physical copy of this one because I was so excited, and ended up really enjoying the handheld experience of this title specifically. I think a lot of the narrative beats are kind of built around the fact that you're going to be playing this one in short bursts rather than a long extended period of time. How did you play it, Pat?
I emulated the same version, the DS version. And while I agree with you that in terms of playtime, it is probably best on a handheld, I do actually think that once again, mouse controls over touchscreen controls are superior here. The reason for that is you have to do a lot of clicking and dragging as your main method of control. And it just seems to me that it's easier with a mouse because you're obscuring less of the screen as you're clicking and dragging around than if you were using your finger. But you'd have a better idea of what that's like. But for me, the only thing that kind of like irritated me from a control perspective is how zoomed in it is, which makes sense because it was on DS, but the large computer screen definitely could have had more visible on screen at any one time.
Yeah, they do at least use the smaller screen real estate as a narrative device sometimes by hiding things just off screen for you to find later in a moment of surprise. So it's
Hmm.
not all, negative. I generally found the touch controls worked great with stylus. And there's also the option of using like the joystick or, D-pad, which I did on my 3DS. So it's pretty good.
So let's talk about what this game is and its presentation, kind of like dabbling a bit into the basic gameplay. We won't really discuss it. We just want to paint a picture for you for what this game looks like and plays like.
Yeah, because this one's pretty unique, right? Like, even for a puzzle game.
Yes, I haven't played anything quite like this before. So, from a top down level, it is a 2D side scroller perspective. So, you are looking at the screen as if it was a point and click adventure game or a Mario game. It is 2D. Now, it is trying to show you three-dimensional scenes in some places, which is a bit weird with, staircases in the background or objects in the foreground, but it's very much 2D, and for the most part, that doesn't matter too much. There are a couple of times where it does matter and it's a little confusing, but it is very much 2D. So you play as a ghost in the game Ghost Trick Phantom Detective. Your only existence is haunting objects. So you are not a character that's moving around on a screen. You are you basically exist only in the cause of inanimate objects.
Yeah, you're like a little glowing blue spirit that jumps from object to object, essentially.
But you can't like get up and float around. You are locked to the objects and you jump between objects by clicking and dragging, in my case, from one object to another. You can only move between objects on the screen with a core. So not all of the objects on the screen have a core, which is important because the screens are quite detailed and filled with things. So you can't just endlessly jump around. You are limited in what you can move between. Secondly, you can only move if they are within a certain radius of you. So you can't just jump from any object to any object, they have to be close by. The final bit to this layer of the gameplay is that certain objects have abilities. And those abilities are very limited. So if you're inside a chest of drawers, you are often able to open the drawer or open the cupboard. If there is a fan, you can switch the fan on. And a lot of what these things do is that they affect the environment or the locations of other objects in minor ways, which, does certainly capture the idea of a ghost and hauntings, because a lot of the time you think of ghosts as being able to have minor effects on their environment, and this is exactly that. So that's layer one of the puzzle of this game. It's simply being able to move around because you are restricted in your movement around the screen. So the layer two, which is kind of like the more substantive layer of this game, although all of that stuff gets tied in, is that there is a large timing-based layer to the puzzle gameplay. You often need to interact with objects that are moving, or you need to move around at specific times to interact with an active scene. So part of the puzzle gameplay is that a scene will be playing out in front of you where characters do certain things at certain times. And by interacting with an object or, doing the object haunting at the correct time, you can change the environment in a significant way just with very precise timing.
Yeah, a good example of this would be there's like a ceiling fan with a rope and tennis ball attached to one of the blades that's spinning around the room. If you get in the tennis ball, then the ball will swing around the room. You can actually, when you're moving your character, you actually stop time. So you'll wait for the ball to be, on the left of the screen, then you'll pause time, then you'll jump out of the ball into a toy car, and then you'll interact with the toy car to make it, move down a slope or something like that.
Yes, and that's also worth noting. There are two ways to interact. So you have the regular screen, which is where you activate objects, and then you press Ghost, and Ghost is how you move between cores. So you need to switch modes in order to progress through these things. You can't just do it all at once, which is very meaningful. And there are some interesting inconsistencies, which we'll get into the gameplay later. But those two screens are very different, and it cannot always be swapped between freely.
Yeah, and one key thing is that you can't use the interact action while time is stopped. You have to use it while time is flowing, which means the manner of timing things actually ends up being a bit more challenging because of that sometimes.
Surprisingly precise at times, I would say, yeah. So that's a basic idea. I do think this is one where it's probably helpful if you just watch a 1 minute YouTube clip to get an idea, but hopefully we've painted a vivid enough picture. We will return to the gameplay, but we think that it's a better idea generally to start with presentation and story. So we're going to put that aside for one moment and jump back to presentation, which encompasses how the game looks, how it feels, and the music, of course. So, James, did you enjoy playing this Ace Attorney game?
It was incredible. I would say that if you only had the gameplay by itself and none of the window dressings that surround it, it would be a much less enjoyable game. I'd say that the fact that the world is so detailed, so vividly animated and drawn, and everything has great music and sound effects. All of the window dressing in this game is honestly the best part in some ways. Similarly to Ace Attorney, as you mentioned, they do a really, really good job with character animation. So one of the key, I guess, ideas behind the animation style in the Ace Attorney games is that the animations are generally very brief but very high impact in terms of the, I guess, emotional response that they elicit. You'll have 1 or 2 frames, nothing, and they'll make characters seem incredibly lively and animated with just this tiny amount of animation. And that goes really well with the gameplay in Ghost Trick, where you are often possessing items in the world, and interacting with them causes them to make one of these 1 or 2 frame animations that is very fluid and very, visually appealing. I think the game is a joy to interact with. And the cutscenes and the dialogue also ends up being very engaging rather than passive with the player, just how often it pauses for a character to do a little animation. I thought presentation, they knocked it out of the park with this one.
I completely agree, particularly the animation. It is remarkable how good it looks, and my initial understanding was that it must have been rotoscoped, because the way the characters turn, even something as simple as that, is just so lifelike with how they've done it, while also being stylistically unique. I haven't ever really seen a game that looks like this before, but it is incredibly compelling. And as you said, it's a complete joy to watch the animation in progress.
I don't think there's a single bit of mundane animation in this game. Even things as simple as a character walking from one side of the screen to the other, or an object sliding across the ground, every single one is incredibly handcrafted to be exciting and engaging to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I will say Cabanella's walking did irritate me. I thought that was just a little bit over the top.
That was the best part.
Yeah, I just thought it was a little bit over the top. I know what they were trying to do. They were trying to do a cool animation, but I kind of liked the more subtle ones, the girl sitting on the couch eating donuts, for example. To me, that was far more compelling than the over the top ridiculous dance that he kept doing over and over again.
I had that in my notes as my favorite part of the whole game.
Wow. I guess that just shows how different we are. And maybe this will be an ongoing thing, because I think that while this does touch into story a bit, I found that, the game was at its best. Okay, here's the thing. I tend to prefer more subtle storytelling generally, and
Yeah, that's not this game at all.
it is not this game, and it is not Ace Attorney. There are some, and this is something that is kind of part of this kind of game's character. They do not do subtlety. They're not interested in subtlety. They are interested in mystery, but when it comes to actually unveiling those mysteries, less so. And I do think that it works in the sense that it stays exciting and engaging in the moment, but it's not something I can really sink into and become immersed in, because it's so focused on being entertaining as opposed to being, I don't know, restrained and immersive.
In terms of immersion, I actually think that's one of the things the game does exceptionally well, also, in terms of its presentation. So, generally, the puzzles, like everything that happens in the game, takes place in a real world kind of location in the game setting. Like, the puzzles aren't in abstract game space, they're in like a character's bedroom or something, right? And the way you generally move about from between scene to scene is not with like there's a screen transition and you teleport, like you appear where you need to be. The game takes place over a continuous 12-hour period. And throughout that entire period, you are generally always in control of your character, who manages to jump around the world via telephone lines. So, in order to, travel somewhere distant quickly, you need to be possessing a telephone during a phone call, at which point you kind of like unlock fast travel to that other location, which, oftentimes these locations will be inaccessible for narrative reasons, like the phone was destroyed or disconnected or something. But generally, like, you always move your character from scene to scene yourself. You don't have other characters moving you often. And I generally found that even though some of the progression's pretty linear, I still felt quite immersed because of this kind of framing that you're generally always in control. To top it off, like narratively, the game takes place over 12 hours, while also the actual time it takes you, the player, to complete the game is about 12 hours as well. I think they generally did like a really good job of just immersing you in the world.
The big difference with Ace Attorney, because this game is Ace Attorney in a lot of ways, is that Ace Attorney has this thing where you've got this long story bit, which is fucking terrible, where you're investigating the scene, and then you go to the courtroom and it's excellent. And that big story dump bit has very little gameplay, and it can last like an hour. Ghost Trick will seed the gameplay and story bits in smaller chunks throughout the
Mm.
entire runtime. And so it doesn't, I mean, for me, with Ace Attorney, I would be clicking through frustrated. This game, I wasn't, because it wasn't just interested in info dumping me for 20 minutes straight. You'd have 5 to 10 minutes of story, then you'd have gameplay, and it was even broken up in smaller bits as well when you moved around the environment a little bit and solved like a little mini puzzle in order to progress. So I think that from that perspective, definitely it was a more continuous immersive adventure. It's just tonally it wasn't necessarily the most immersive thing for me, which is true of Ace Attorney as well. Those games are just far too interested in being fun for me to really get
And
involved.
Patrick hates fun.
I do sometimes, yes. Although I have played a lot of Ace Attorney games now, so maybe I don't hate it as much as I think.
Yeah, I will admit that while this game does try to straddle this fine line between silly and serious, it does more often lead towards silly than it does serious.
It's a PG game, right? And this is
Yeah.
the thing. It's the same with Ace Attorney. A lot of the time, they're dealing with like very serious, dark issues, but they can't actually tackle them in serious, dark ways because that game's for children, right? So, what that means is that it leans into the lightheartedness and silliness. But that means that the potential drama or I guess emotionality of a lot of these things, I just care less about because the game is so silly at a baseline.
There were a couple of moments where it kind of like left its sphere of comic safety, I think, and was a bit more shocking. Like not crazy, so like example is that guy shooting the dog just with a gun, like on screen, is like kind of shocking in the moment.
I
Like I
mean, to
wasn't
be fair,
expecting that
Missile
out of a
was about to kill him, so he had to do it in
It's true.
self-defense. Ugh.
Best character.
Um,
Um,
and we need to talk about the music as well, Jen.
yeah, it's very good. Like
It's
probably
unbelievably good.
yeah, like there isn't a bad track on the soundtrack. It does my favorite thing in one of these narrative-driven games where the music will switch constantly during conversation. Like dialogue isn't content to just play one song for 4 minutes while you watch it. It's very dynamic. Like they will switch tracks every other line. You know, the dialogue in general I thought was really well done. You'll have a 2D sprite talking and oftentimes it'll disappear off screen to show a 3D animation in the background. The music will change, that kind of thing is great.
The music also gets interrupted, which is very cool. Like something shocking will happen, and the music just cuts out with the
Yeah, and
shocking
there's
moment.
silence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the thing about this music is, so when we played Ace Attorney, I said that the music was essential to the experience. I think the same is true of Ghost Trick. I cannot imagine playing this game without the music. To me, that would be a crime against humanity. Like it doesn't make any sense to me because the music is so essential to the tones and feelings that this game is trying to convey.
Yeah, I think without the music, that thing they're trying to do where they flip flop between comic relief and more serious scenes would not work as, well as it does. Like, I don't think they always hit the mark here, straddling that line, but like a large part of what allows them to succeed as often as they do is the ability to have really good soundtrack that really clearly evokes a certain theme. Like the tense and serious tracks are really tense and serious, while the more light-hearted tunes or the more uplifting ones are, right? And that goes a long way. And they're not particularly complex either. Like each track has a small number of synthesized instruments, dealing with the original DS's hardware limitations. But they squeeze the most out of each one, just like they do with the animations, I think.
It's hard for me to understand even why I like this soundtrack as much as I do, because when I'm actually trying to break it down and analyze, I'm like, there's nothing going on here. But then I just hear it, I'm like, man, this music's great. I
It's
can't
so
explain
earnest
it.
and upbeat half the time.
Let's play some music now. I know it's a bit early, but we're talking about it, James, so we may as well.
Yeah, okay. Did you have one in particular? I actually found it so hard to pick one. So I'll just do what I normally do because Patrick will pick something more low key, and I'll, pick something exactly the opposite.
Okay, so the track I will choose is 4 minutes before death. So the game does a thing, and this is one of the key mechanics, is that you can rewind before people's death. If you find a dead body and you occupy that dead body, you can rewind 4 minutes before their death and try to stop them from dying, change their fate. It's a time loop game. It's Hitman. It's Outer Wilds.
I mean, in fact, I would say that the majority of puzzles in this game are about trying to stop someone dying, which I really actually appreciate as being, that each of the puzzles has real stakes behind it, right?
Exactly. It really gives you a reason to do things. Like it creates tension, right? Because you've got such a short time in which to do it. So this is the track that plays when you rewind 4 minutes before their death, and you get to see the scene play out that kills that person. And yeah, I just think it does a great job setting the scene, creating tension as it races towards its inevitable conclusion. Because you know the person's going to die, but you don't know exactly how it's going to happen. So every single one of these scenes was absolutely entrancing as it played out, and I enjoyed every single one. So here is 4 minutes before death.
Alrighty, that was 4 minutes before death. Absolutely banger of a track. Loved, just like Patrick said, I think the lead up to each puzzle was superb. Like it really, really makes you want to solve them. Because every puzzle in this game, I would say, is complex and layered. There is a lot going on, and there has to be, because generally your method of solving them is by sort of, using all the objects in the world in tandem as some kind of contraption that you've cooked up to get all the dominoes to align in order to avert the death of one of the characters. So really top stuff. Should we go into a bit about the narrative framing of the game,
Yeah.
how it starts off?
Let's talk story and characters, and obviously spoilers. Now, I don't think we need to actually get into specific spoilers for the most part. This is a mystery game, so the story is important. A lot gets revealed over the course of the story, but I'm pretty happy to talk about this in general terms. Nonetheless, little spoilers may slip out. So if you care about being completely spoiler free, you can come back later when we're talking more about gameplay. So story setup. I guess the where it starts is that you are a ghost in a junkyard and you are in a dead body, and a person is with you, and it appears that you have been killed. It might have been by that person, it might have been by someone else. You have no idea. You have a tutorial where you encounter what appears to be another ghost in a lamp that explains to you that you now have powers, and you gain the ability to rewind time to save people who are dead, to change their fate. How did you feel about this initial story setup, James, with a sense of mystery? Were you immediately intrigued?
Oh, it's awesome, right? I think it's really great. They started off with a bang, right? Like, there's a murder mystery. The guy who was killed was you. Got to figure out why. I think that's a pretty compelling way to begin. And I think that the narrative decision to begin the game in a junkyard is a really good one in order to show off how the game's mechanics work. It's just filled with stuff that you can possess and interact with. It makes a really great opening few hours to the game, I think.
So one of the things I want to ask you, James, is that as the game begins, you have a clear goal. You want to find out who you are, because you don't know who you are. You have lost your memory. You've got amnesia, however you want to put it. But as the game continues, that whole goal kind of becomes sidetracked in favor of kind of just doing the thing in front of you, which is usually saving someone, doing the moral thing. Do you feel like this hook of trying to find out who you were was really relevant beyond that tutorial, or did you think it remained compelling throughout the entire story?
So, to be clear, this was the plot point that had been spoiled to me prior to starting the game. So I actually knew the answer to this before I began. So it's hard for me to tell, because obviously, as a person, I'm not that interested. However, I do agree with you that the focus of the game is more on the narrative mystery behind the side, that's going on with the side characters more than you personally. And I think that that was a good decision narratively, because ultimately many of the puzzles in the game revolve around one of the characters from this core cast is going to die unless you save them. So having the focus be on them, being on their worries and the things they're trying to achieve, kind of adds more weight to the puzzles as you're trying to solve them. Makes you care more about the characters you're trying to save, and generally, this one murder mystery of your own that turns into potentially several bigger mysteries, I think ends up being, as you say, more compelling and overshadowing that main initial plot point.
Yeah, my only problem with this is that it's the same problem I had with Cave's story, which is that you're kind of just along for the ride and doing what you're told, or doing what seems to be immediately in front of you.
Mm.
It's not really clear the degree to which you're, I guess, invested in this, other than being a good person. Like if you were in this spot and this was all you could do, well, you probably would save people instead of not saving them. I still think it's fine because the side mystery is compelling enough and is kind of like
Yeah.
very complicated and wrapped up in all these threads that you want to figure out and find out what's happening. But I don't really think there's much of a connection from the main character. And the purpose of that is to help preserve the mystery, right? Like, if you don't know anything and you don't know any of these characters, then it is a genuine mystery. But I do think it's interesting how that whole identity thing is kind of a thing at the very beginning and it's a thing at the very end and is not really referenced at all in the middle chunk of the game or is irrelevant in the middle chunk of the game.
Yeah, there are little bits and pieces like you seeing footage of yourself in the midpoints that kind of reinforce and remind you that this is something you care about. But
Mm.
yeah, like you said, it is kind of in the back of your mind. One thing narratively I did want to talk about is just how good a job they did of making basically every character side, like whether they're a very background or major player, be relevant in the plot. I feel like there's almost no wasted characters here. The same with locations. There's pretty much, no filler in terms of characterization. Even characters who initially appear to be not important or little things, details in the background that appear to not be not important end up being relevant later on in the story, which is something I generally consistently enjoyed throughout the runtime.
Yeah, it's a very tight knit story. And you're absolutely right about there not being that many wasted characters. It reminds me a lot of classic noir storytelling because they will often do the same thing where characters who just seem to have had minor roles early in the film end up being absolutely critical players later on. And even if they're not critical, yeah, you're right. Characters are reused and not wasted. A good example of that is at one point, a character says they're hungry. So someone rings the chicken dinner place
Yeah.
to get them some food. And then it ends up being a critical location with repeating characters like multiple times. And it does that with everything. It's very rare that there's a call. I mean, at no point is there a call somewhere and that location is only used once.
And I really enjoyed that about the game. And even further than that, like when you generally visit these seemingly unimportant locations and find that there's nothing there, if you go into ghost mode, you can see the place is littered with cores that you could possess if only you could get to them, which, they're real objects that make sense in these real locations, right? Like,
Mm.
like a bell at the chicken place, for example. And it's not immediately obvious, like, how this will be relevant to you later in the game, but like every single one eventually is useful somehow, right? It's awesome.
Yeah. To move on to something that I didn't like about this story, and this is one of the things that did remind me intensely of Ace Attorney, is that it feels at times stretched and bloated. The thing about the
Okay.
storytelling in this game and Ace Attorney, I know I keep bringing that up, but it's exactly the same, is that it is not subtle and it loves to reiterate and retell over and over and over again. And this becomes even more noticeable when you're doing multiple chapters in a row. There's a lot to be said for this meant to be played at a chapter at a time and then have a break. Because if you do 3 chapters at once, it starts to become frustrating how often it will just say the same thing over and over again because it really doesn't want to lose you or there to be any misunderstanding whatsoever. Um, I don't know how to what degree this bothered you, James, but for me, it meant that at times I was like, please, can we just get over this story bit? Because I'm sick of hearing the same thing over and over again. I get it. You don't need to do a flashback 6 times to show me something that happened 3 minutes ago.
I didn't find that happened too often for me. Granted, I basically played this as intended in that I would play a bit until it got to a cool off phase and then I would stop playing. So I generally wasn't getting annoyed by this. I think I only played maybe the last 3 chapters all in one go, but for the rest, I was playing it 15, 20, 30 minutes at a time for the whole
Mm.
runtime. So And that kind of makes sense with the hardware and the way that these games were designed to be played. But I get it because there's like often characters talking and reiterating the same points, and then the screen will fade to black. You get white text that reiterates again. I could see how that's annoying. I don't think it was like I've played games that do this worse for sure. And I think with like a PG game it's intended for a wider audience, including young children, you probably want to lean more on this side than like only repeating things once, right?
Well, yeah, I guess yes. This is clearly intended for a wider audience, right? Like, and it's in everything. The game is exceptionally good at tutorializing you and making sure you don't go down the wrong track. If ever you go to a location you shouldn't have gone to, it tells you. If ever you don't know what to do, there are these optional speech bubbles that are up there, which pretty much tell you explicitly what to do or what to focus on from a gameplay sense. And the story is very much, it kind of leads you along. The dialogues you have with characters are very exposition heavy, and the exposition heavy in a very linear way to make sure you take away the critical information from that conversation. This is all fine. Like, I'm not saying that this is a intrinsically a bad way to do storytelling. Clearly this allows it to be more accessible, but for me personally, it's uninspired. It's a very boring, bloated way to tell a story. I tend to prefer my conversations to be a bit more naturalistic. I prefer the stories of games and movies to trust the player a bit more to understand what's happening. And that is not the case in this game. It has very little trust for the player, and it wants to very carefully guide the player through its experience.
Yeah, I will say there is something there that hit a sour note for me as well, which was it did at times feel a bit too linear in terms of what you can do. Like the game went well out of its way to try and make you feel like you were in complete control with the way movement through the world works and stuff like that. But oftentimes you won't really have that many options available to you. I understand why, because and this like bleeds over into the gameplay puzzles too, which tend to be somewhat linear. Like there aren't too many ways to make mistakes or do things poorly. It would be super frustrating if there was like dozens of ways to fail at solving the puzzles. There aren't, but it did feel a bit handholdy at times. I'll give it that. Narratively, I actually don't have this share this criticism with you, Pat, because I generally found that even when dialogue dragged on a bit, individual lines were generally entertaining, and they did a good job of splitting things up with the music and the animation and comic relief, that I was like pretty content to just sit there through a whole dialogue scene and be happy doing it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I agree with that. I think once again, from a presentation point of view, this game absolutely nails it, and it's enjoyable in the moment. It's just more structurally, I have a problem with it. So
Yeah,
it's
honestly, that I think your issue actually is it's more of an issue in the serious moments to me, because they like double down on making sure you know that serious piece of information, and they try not to interject with comic relief during
yes.
some of these. And it's those ones that drag on a bit longer than they should, right?
Completely agree. That's actually a really good way to put it, because definitely I didn't think like the silly and fun moments were drawn out. It was these serious moments where they felt like they needed you to understand what was happening from a plot perspective. What
Yeah.
did you think of the characters, James?
Oh, I love all of them. Okay, that's too far. There are some problems I have with characters, particularly some of the villains. I think are a bit whatever. I think all the main cast are great. I actually was interesting that you pointed out Cabanella being over the top. He's actually, in my mind, both the most over the top character and the most subtle in some ways, because on the surface he's very in your face, and the game kind of sets him up in a certain way and then breaks it later.
Mm.
And if you go back through cutscenes and stuff and watch his actions, he's actually like doing a lot of stuff in the background as well as all this like in your face kind of stuff. So
Mm.
he was my favorite character by far. I thought he was layered compared to some of the others.
Yeah, I do agree
Um,
with that. He is playing a role basically for the player,
yeah,
which is the over the top ostentatious thing. I just found that role to be really annoying, not entertaining.
I loved it. And then honestly, I liked the funny characters the most, like Lynn, Missile, the two guards at the prison.
Yeah, the
Um,
one that yeah, they are good. I like Lynn the most. I don't know if that's a basic bitch opinion because she's the main character or
she's
whatever,
so
but
funny.
I thought she was very funny.
Yeah, just the character, I don't know, this is kind of a spoiler, but she gets herself killed like multiple times. It's like throughout the runtime. The first time she's like, haha, I died again. To which, the main character is like, are you fucking kidding me?
Hmm.
It's great. Yeah, I really like the characterization in this one. It's like the 2D sprites are great and well drawn with a lot of personality. The low poly, like low detail DS 3D, where the animations come into play, are also really well done. They don't need to, like, each time a character is shown on screen for the first time, they really don't need a lot of screen time for you to understand the characters. Like, they will have two lines of dialogue and one little animation, and you feel like you know everything about the character, even if there's plot twists later that recontextualize your opinion. But generally, they're very good at being like sort of relatable and understandable and just fun. Generally, I'd think.
My only problem with the characters is that there's not enough assassins because at the start of the game you have the nearsighted assassin and then you have the always ahead Eddie. And at that when I saw that second assassin, I was like, yes, this game is gonna have 10 assassins with stupid names who all have their own unique gimmick. But it's over after the second one, James.
Yeah,
I was so
I was
disappointed.
expecting more too.
Yeah, that is a significant criticism I have of this game. There's not more silly assassins. There should have been a lot more.
I mean, it's not without its silly characters. I found all of them very entertaining. I was actually, I want to call out Missile especially, as I think it's very easy because he's this little dog character who's extremely over energetic and loud and stupid and barks constantly, right?
Mm.
And I find it like it's very easy to make a character like this like insufferably obnoxious. I think they like managed to make him endearing, which goes a long way.
I think they nailed it. The only other one which I think is good as this. Have you seen Up?
I have seen Up.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
great
dog in
film.
Up when they get their
Yes,
collars. Yeah,
the
I got
squirrel.
a lot of the
Yeah,
same.
it's the same.
Yeah, it's the same, and it's not an easy thing to do to capture the personality of a dog that's speaking to you. But I think they absolutely nailed it, and he's absolutely great. Just like Ace Attorney, the characters are excellent. I think they're actually better here than in Ace Attorney.
Yeah,
Because I fucking hate Francesca. Like, I don't know why people love that character so much. I think she's insufferably annoying. And there was no character on Francesca tier to me. They were quite good. Oh, you don't know Francesca? I think is she in a later game? I think she might be.
I think she's like the prosecutor in a sec 2 or 3, right?
She just assaults people. That's her gimmick. She assaults people, and that's funny. I'm like, I don't get it. The other
no
prosecutors are all
Edgeworth.
better.
Honestly, one thing I think this does much better than Ace Attorney 1 specifically. I don't know about the later games, is that
They're all the same.
the comic relief characters here are less abrasive. Like there are some really abrasive characters in one, whereas I think basically everyone ends up being endearing to some degree here.
Yeah, the guards are good. Right? Like they're pretty.
The guards are great.
Yeah.
Like even the governor's wife, the lady with the rose hair, was like abrasive, but also like kind of funny at the end.
She even has a little twist that kind of like shows that she was almost, she was justified in what she was doing to some degree, which I thought was really well done.
Actually, great. Yeah, I like when they portray, because it's very easy for them to portray the characters as being like shallow on the surface with how comic reliefy they are and how exaggerated the animations are. And then they generally go out of their way to give them each like a bit of extra depth to make them feel more, you know,
Yeah,
less like they exist just for a joke.
to some degree, though, it does become a bit glory for me, like a bit
Yeah,
insufferably
sure.
happy and warm. I'm like, come on. Just, particularly the ending of this game. Oh my god, it's just it
Uh,
was too much. It was too happy. I was like, blah, blah.
I actually quite liked the ending, other
Yeah, you
than I
would.
actually felt that the way the final puzzle resolved was a bit boring, to be
It
honest.
was more of a narrative thing than a final puzzle. That's how I viewed it.
Yeah, I was actually looking forward to that final puzzle because I guessed what they were going to do.
Mm.
Um, but then the way they did it was really disappointing to
I,
me because you
I'm not.
haven't.
I'm not actually surprised because I mean we'll talk about this later, but I don't think this game actually has like a super high difficulty curve. Like it's
No,
fairly flat, and I think that as
that's
you move
fine.
towards the ending, it very much becomes a lot more about the story. So you kind of see a more cinematic resolution as opposed to a puzzle resolution. From a big picture, I think the thing about these games that's interesting is that they're equally puzzle and story games, and I actually would even say they're more story games than puzzle games.
Yep.
It feels like, and maybe this is once again a difference between how this studio does these kind of games and how an indie studio might approach it. But they
Yep.
haven't sought to create some sick, slick puzzle mechanics and then made that front and center and came up with a narrative. They've kind of like wanted to tell this story really badly and they've integrated that with puzzles.
Yeah, the puzzles are part of the story, right? Like
Yes.
everything, every single, item you interact with has a narrative reason for being there, essentially, right? There's no abstract puzzle solving. It's all very immersive, very diegetic,
Mm.
uh, which, I think ends up adding a lot to it.
It adds in one sense, but I do, and we'll get into this in gameplay. I do think it can take away from the slickness of the gameplay potentially,
Yep.
because the gameplay is not as smooth and slick as it potentially could be, and the main reason for that is because of how closely integrated it is with these story elements.
Yeah, so there was one more thing I wanted to talk about. We were talking about narrative. This is primarily, first and foremost, a mystery. We did discuss how maybe the main character's personal mystery isn't particularly compelling, but I want to talk about the general mystery structure of as a whole, and how it plays out over the course of the 17 chapters. One thing that I think the game did exceptionally well is basically every single of the 17 chapters had some kind of plot twist or revelation that made some innocuous thing actually kind of important, or revealed new information, or wanted to, like, made you want to see more. I've seen a lot of mysteries done really poorly. I think that generally this game did a really good job of like constantly, throwing you twists and turns, and then having a resolution that actually makes sense and feels like a good payoff for everything that came before. Because it's very easy for a mystery to kind of just throw mysterious things at you, one or another, that are very appealing, very interesting, and then not really have a good idea of what to do with any of it. This game had a clear vision beginning to end, and I think just felt very, well constructed.
I think this is the best version of a story of this kind can be. Like, it's very well
Hmm.
done with how the threads keep unwinding. Our characters gradually reveal information to keep you hooked without spoiling it all at once. But I will say the nature of this style of storytelling is that you have literally zero agency. And I'd say
Yep.
the key difference between this and your typical noir storyline is that in a noir story, you usually have the main character as a detective or a detective like, and the detective is going out of their way to attempt to solve a mystery, and often the mystery is a lot more complicated than they attempted. But the detective is actively trying to do things. That is not the case here. Here, you're kind of just going along, and the story is being unfolded to you at the rate which the other characters want to let you know about. So I'd
Out of
say
curiosity, what about specifically, what about main character agency, or a lack thereof, do you think is beneficial or a detriment to a narrative?
Well, I mean, great question. I would say the thing that I like about agency is that it makes you feel more immersed in trying to find out what has happened.
Mm.
You will be more invested if you are taking actions to find out what's happened. In this, the characters will know stuff and they won't tell you, but they're going to tell you anyway. You just kind of keep doing things in a row and the story gradually gets unveiled to you. It's not me actively seeking out the story.
Yeah, or making conclusions yourself. And that's particularly important for a video game, right, that's interactive. Because I actually don't, I see there being less value to that in a passive kind of experience, like when you read a book or something. Because generally, if any of the characters take initiative, that's good enough for me personally, even if the main character's dragged along a bit. But specifically for a video game, it does feel like it's a bit handholdy when the main character who you're controlling is getting dragged around, with like leash and collar, right?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because reflecting on it, one of my favorite films of all time is one called The Big Lebowski. And the whole idea of that is that it's a satirical take on the noir genre where the main character is just getting pulled around and effectively has no agency. And I
Mm.
love that film to pieces. So I wonder what it is I love about that I don't love about Ghost Trick Phantom Detective. Maybe I'm just biased against video games. I don't know. But I don't think this is a huge issue, by the way. I do think that there's no doubt that the story is very compelling and interesting. It's just it is worth noting that you are a very passive observer throughout. Well, not passive observer because you're doing a lot, but you're very passive in terms of the role you play in unveiling the mystery.
Yeah, and I generally agree with that. So we'll do one more music break because I want to contrast Patrick's pick with something more lighthearted. And now I was tossing and turning about which song to pick there because they're all so great. And now that Patrick said he didn't like it, I'm going to have to pick uh, Agent Cabanella's theme because it's just
I didn't even
the
hate his
best.
theme. To be clear, his theme is good. All the music is good. There's no bad music.
Agent Cabanella is a very in your face kind of like male character who dances basically everywhere he goes. He struts around. The way he's introduced is dancing down a set of stairs. He's all style, all pizzazz. I thought it was great from start to
He's
finish.
disco.
So, yeah, he's very disco.
70s disco character.
Yeah. So this is Agent Cabanella's theme. Alrighty, let's go a bit into detail about some of the specifics on gameplay and story. I wanted to ask you, Pat, what's your favorite puzzle?
Great question. So I think, can I have a second to think about this? Sorry.
Yeah, of course. I'll just talk about mine then. So my favorite was the one where one of the characters is basically having a heart attack, because that puzzle, more than any other, I think allowed the player to make significant mistakes. There was a lot of pieces on screen at once, which I like because some of these puzzles are very linear in that there's often only one or two paths for your little ghost to travel to, which makes it not actually feel like solving a puzzle, but more like you just progressing the puzzle linearly in a narrative way. This was, one of the ones that made me have to think about it. And once you got all the pieces into place and you set the dominoes, firing, it was very satisfying to watch go. I thought it was excellent.
That one was a very good one. I liked that one as well because, as you said, there were a lot of ways to make little errors, but those little errors often were a clue as to what to actually do.
Yeah.
And as you said, it felt less linear than the other ones. So yeah, I think that's a good one. That would be one of my favorites. I'd say I actually quite enjoyed one of the earlier puzzles where the assassin shows up at Lynn and Camilla's apartment, and you
Yes,
had
that was
to
good.
you had to figure out the right moment to make the donut fall, the right moment to make open the door cupboard. And it was really early on as well, so I found it compelling because I didn't quite understand the game fully at that point. So it was a lot of experimentation and figuring out the correct time to interact with objects in order to get the intended effects.
Mm.
So yeah, I would highlight that puzzle as well as being quite a good one.
I also quite liked the puzzles that did that kind of like Inception thing where you'd be in one puzzle and then your character would kind of get stuck. And in order to solve it, you'd have to go into another puzzle through a phone line to a completely different location, solve a sub puzzle there, and then come back.
I was certain that it would lean into that heavily in the final puzzle. Like there'd be a thing
Yeah.
where I'd have to jump like 4 bodies back, and then there'd be like this big domino effect. But
Yeah.
we unfortunately never got that.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking would happen too. So about this point, 1 hour into the episode, it's going to be hard not to spoil anything. I'm not going to talk about lots of specific plot points, but there are actually a couple of gameplay spoilers later on in the game that are significant that I want to discuss. So maybe skip ahead 5-10 minutes from this moment if you want to preserve that. Probably my single favorite moment in the whole game was getting the second ghost power.
Mm.
I thought that was awesome. Also, I did not expect it to come from the dog.
Yeah, that was very funny.
Yeah, because initially, up until this point, you can basically jump into objects and activate them. At this point in the story, you get a second ghost who can jump way further at a time and has the ability to swap the position of objects, which adds like this multi-layer thing into the puzzle solving, which I really enjoyed. I thought that was like a great touch.
Yeah, it was, and I thought it was a good escalation in complexity when at that point it seemed like the puzzles weren't really getting any harder. It felt like we were kind of sailing on linearly. I'm like, oh, okay, now I have two ghosts and need to swap two things. It was more interesting. From a big picture, I guess it's important. One of the things to understand about this game, and I think this kind of leans into the linearity here, James, is that Ghost Trick isn't trying to give you a physics sandbox, which you then can manipulate in reliable ways in order to get an outcome that you want to. It's more that each and every scenario has a bunch of objects that act in unique, sometimes unexpected ways. And you kind of need to experiment and play with how each of those objects functions to get the expected result. Did you feel like you were able to predict what things would do or how they would affect the environment in most instances? Or did you feel that you had to just play with things, see how they worked, and that would eventually lead you towards a puzzle solution?
It was a bit of a mix of both. Generally, I couldn't just look at the puzzle on first blush and immediately figure out the correct solution. I did have to try and fail a fair few times on some of them, and it's, as you said, it's because there are either unpredictable things in the way that objects activate, or unpredictable things in terms of like, because the puzzles aren't static in time, they're over a set 4 minute period, and generally throughout that 4 minute during that 4 minutes, other characters in the background will do things like they'll throw a tennis ball across the room, someone will drive a truck it through the front door or something, which will completely change the object that you have available to you. So it's not often just a matter of playing with the items, but also seeing how the environment changes over time before you can know, when you need to do things, what you need to do things to, etc. And I'd say this probably added to the game for me, especially because that unpredictability meant that I had this expectation that every single object I would go into would have a unique, unexpected animation that plays with it.
Mm.
And we've already established that the animations are really good. So it kind of led this like bit of anticipation to every single new item I jumped into, which was cool.
Exploration, if you will.
Yeah.
And that's how I think a lot of the time these puzzles go. It's a bit of exploration and playing around with things.
Mm.
The only downside with that is sometimes you can solve puzzles before you understand that you're solving them, and that happened to me a few times where I was just doing things in a sequence, not really understanding where they would lead, and it just led to me getting most of the way through the puzzle. That's what
Yep.
happened with the one where you had to trap the woman inside the chandelier. I was just taking random legal actions, James, and eventually I got right up to the end of that puzzle, just because I was just clicking buttons,
Yep.
essentially. Um, I would say that it's fine. Like this is something that irritated me a bit at first because I couldn't predict what would happen, but then I realized that's just part of the intended game loop. You're meant to jump in, see what every object does, and then figure it out after that. What I will say irritates me greatly about this game is the unpredictability over whether activating an object will allow you to immediately switch to ghost mode and when it will not.
Yep.
And there is no way to tell, and it is extremely inconsistent. And the reason for this is that if it were to let you swap at will every time an animation plays, it would break a lot of these puzzles, right? Or it
Yep.
would break the timing of them in some way. But it's still frustrating how inconsistently this happens because it's hard to, I guess, intuitively grasp a path to the solution when the objects aren't acting consistently. So there's one in particular where you're trying to make this big mechanism work by like shooting streamers over a fan. And
Mm.
there's one where the fan will go up and then down. And you cannot swap to ghost mode after you activate it. You are locked inside that fan as it slowly moves up and slowly moves down. And I just couldn't understand it. And it's because it needed to not let you do it in order for the puzzle to function. But that doesn't make it any less frustrating. And when you're trying to solve the puzzle by looking at it, uh, it's annoying because you see a solution, but that solution doesn't work because it feels like it's arbitrarily locking you out of swapping to ghost mode.
Yeah, I had that a couple of times, as you said. I found, yeah, that one with the first Rube Goldberg machine, which is, uh, can I just say, like, the use of a Rube Goldberg machine
It's
in the
perfect.
context of this game is perfect. Like, the
Yeah.
fact that it's, like, a serious plot point in the game, it's like, it just fits so well. But that first one where you have to, like, kind of do the golf swing, I couldn't figure out what was going on there because the timing was a bit weird.
Hmm.
And I think it was because of that thing you described where it will arbitrarily take control away from you to make sure that an animation plays start to finish before you can do anything.
Hmm.
That is annoying, and generally having control wrested from the player is something that many people despise a lot. I know that I care about this less than some people for sure, but it's still annoying to me.
For me, it's
Um,
it's specifically the inconsistency. So if the game always wrested control away from you during animations, it would be fine, right? Because then you
mm,
could that would be built into your internal logic. The problem is that sometimes you need to go to ghost mode immediately as the animation starts playing because the timing of a lot of these puzzles can be quite precise, right? So
yep,
sometimes you need to do it and sometimes you don't. And it's not something you can do without understanding the timing of every single object, which is a lot to ask the player to internalize when you're looking at a screen with 20 different objects. So
yeah,
I would say this is the one critical error this game makes from a gameplay perspective. It's the inconsistency of that logic. Because with puzzle games, you like to be able to I guess, heuristically apply logic when you're trying to solve a big puzzle. But here
Mm.
you cannot do that. You need to have a more specific understanding of each and every component, which meant that you can't do any shortcutting. You really need to just study what each object does. And maybe for some people that's an upside, but for me it was irritating.
Yeah, so I actually completely agree with that. And then in terms of puzzles, I wanted to ask because I actually did a bit of reading about different people's opinions of the various puzzles.
Ah, right.
One that came up consistently was the one where you have to kind of help the guy escape in the
Prison escape,
extended
yeah.
the stealth sequence. How did you feel about that one? Because it was actually, I thought it was pretty cool, but it was consistently mentioned as the least favorite puzzle, like online, as I was seeing.
I basically think it's the coolest puzzle in concept, but I think it's a failure in terms of execution for a couple of
Yeah,
reasons. So the first is I said before this is a 2D game, but it tries to present things in a 3D way in a lot of ways. And one of those was this puzzle where there's like a staircase and there's a ceiling that you have to get into.
yeah.
Um, and I felt like presentation wise, it felt awkward. Like I couldn't clearly see what was going on. The second thing, which I think is a real problem with this, is how little of the screen you can see. And that's
Yeah.
not because it's dark, it's because you need to be able to predict guards' routes from quite far away to get the timing right on some of these movements. But when you're in ghost mode, you can't look around the screen. But when you're not in ghost mode, you don't know what it is you can interact with because the screen is pitch black. So I found it irritating and I found it very guessy. Like I would just
Mm-hmm.
guess. I didn't really figure out the timing. I just tried a few different times. And you have to start the puzzle from the very start every time you fail. So I agree this one sucks, but I wish it were better.
Yeah, I don't hate its existence. This was the only puzzle in the game that I looked up a solution to because it was frustrating
Oh,
me.
okay.
Because like it's very hard to predict what to do. The price of failure is high
Mm,
because there aren't good checkpoints in the level. Like most of the levels after you reach a critical juncture, they give you a checkpoint so you don't
mm,
have to do everything from beginning to end. This one you always pretty much had to do it start to finish, and there was a lot of waiting for guards
yes.
to walk in the right direction. So it was very tedious if you just if you weren't figuring it out, which is something that I assume is going to happen to a lot of people because it's really not obvious to me that the character you're leading has good enough upper body strength to lift himself into a couple of places that he does, or even that that's an option because of the way, like you said, the 2D, 3D is presented.
Mm.
So this one is probably the only one where I felt like, man, I wish I had a fucking fast forward button or something.
Yeah, very cool conceptually though. Like it's an interesting idea to mix it up, but it was bad. It's a stealth segment basically, and stealth segments in non-stealth games usually suck, and this one is no exception. So, yeah, I found it very disappointing and annoying, and it probably took me like 15 tries. Like it
Yep.
took me a lot of tries, and that was a lot of wasted time. So, I was very annoyed by this puzzle.
Yeah. Speaking of stealth games, I heard you compare this to Hitman a couple of times before, and I wanted to say I kind of agree. It's got that same like step one, explore the environment and figure out all of the bits in the level. Step two, make a plan. Step three, execute that plan kind of
It,
thing
it's
going
it's
on,
so
right?
funny, right?
Yeah.
On the Blood Money episode we did, I proposed this like version of Hitman that was like less sandboxy, lent more into the puzzle elements, and kind of committed to this idea of a time loop where things would happen along a set track and you had to interact at specific points in order to get the outcome you wanted.
Oh, this
And
is
that's
the game.
essentially this is that game. Like that's what
Yeah.
Ghost Trick is. Because the core gameplay loop, the more involved gameplay loop, is that you have it's a 4 minutes before death. Usually, it's more like 1 minute or a minute and a half the way it plays out. But you see a scene play out, and you have to interact at exactly the right moment in the right way to change the outcome.
Mm.
Because you're a ghost, you can't do anything significant like jump in and just murder someone. You have to swivel a lamp into someone's eyes at exactly the right moment to change their fate. And I think that this game in most instances absolutely nails that. And the puzzles being based around that idea is very, very cool. Yeah, it's a time loop game at its core, and I love time loop games.
Oh yeah, they're all the best.
Yeah, you'll play Outer Wilds one day, James.
Yeah, I should do
The
that.
the best game.
Uh,
Uh,
did you have any other points on Ghost Trick Phantom Detective, Pat?
I wanted to ask you, how did you feel about the precision of the timing required? I've brought it up a couple of times, but sometimes you have to do things at exactly the right time. I quite enjoyed this. Like, I was
Yeah.
shocked at how precise you needed to be because it felt at odds with the rest of the game. But it was good. It meant that there was a degree of tension in some of the execution of these moves. And I missed the timing a lot of times throughout, and I had to retry it and nail it, and it felt really good.
I liked it a lot too. I felt it added this level of like tactileness to the puzzles. Like it made everything feel like the objects were real rather than they just like exist in this one spot. The fact that things move around, the fact that they move, based on a timer, the fact that you have to sometimes stop time and line up a jump to something. Sometimes you miss or you jump somewhere and end up stuck and have to restart from the beginning. It makes it feel more immersive to me. I really enjoyed that aspect. I was not expecting them to use it as much as they did, and they actually end up using it quite a lot and in more interesting ways as the game goes on. So yeah, was very happy with that.
Very basic one is like someone rides by on a bicycle quickly and you have to jump to the bicycle as it goes past. And I missed it twice. I was like, I have to actually I have to pause at exactly the right moment and zip across. So
yeah, the fact that you pause time when you go into ghost mode, I think makes it a bit more forgiving, so it's fine.
Oh yeah, if you had to do it in real time,
yeah,
Jesus.
that'd be so hard.
Oh yeah, you can even imagine a version of this game where like time played out in slow mo when you're in ghost mode.
Yeah,
instead of it being
the stopping time means it's purely a reaction thing, unless like it takes the element of precision out, which I think makes it more approachable for a general audience, right? Like it's much easier just to do something generally within the right time frame than it is to do something at this right time and accurately like move a mouse in a direction or something. Yeah.
Oh, the other thing I wanted to ask you is there's this one puzzle where you need to stop someone getting shot with a bullet.
Oh,
And
that was great.
I feel like this is one of there's something specific about this that annoyed me.
Really? Okay.
So basically, you're not given the option to swap an object with the bullet until there's something close by that can be swapped with the bullet. So that, you know how towards the end, like time stops when the bullet's in midair?
Oh, yep.
That only happens if there's something to swap when the bullet is in midair.
Yeah, so it's hard to predict again. Yeah, I kind of feel that.
Yeah, like once again, and I mean cinematically and presentation wise, once again, it's good, but it was just an inconsistency with the gameplay that really annoyed me when it did happen because I was like, well, how was I meant to know that was going to happen? Not that like this puzzle's impossibly difficult or anything. It just irritated me that it only happened at a specific time.
Narratively, I thought those two puzzles are pretty great. There's that puzzle specifically you mentioned. There is a new failure condition in that puzzle, and I thought the first time I failed, it was like super cool. Wasn't expecting that.
Is that the one where you get spotted?
Yeah, he kind of like looks towards the screen, and you're like,
Yeah, you've got to do it while his back's turned.
Yeah.
I also thought that it was stupid when you had to like swap the staircase to get the rats to pile up to make the garbage can.
Yeah, that was one.
I was like, come on.
I was
like,
just clicking things.
Exactly, you're just clicking things, and that does happen sometimes where you're just clicking buttons and you end up progressing the puzzle. But that will happen sometimes. I think you just kind of have to accept that there's only so many permutations and you'll stumble into them sometimes.
I did quite like how the bin lids, like perspective, actually mattered. Like it wouldn't work until it was like at the right, like it had settled and was the right shape as the other thing.
That happens with a bullet as well, because if you push the hat to the floor, it is
Yeah, it's
not
in
in
the
the
wrong
shape of a
shape.
bullet. Yeah, yeah.
All right.
But yeah, that's mostly what I have for gameplay. I don't know if you have any further notes.
No, that's pretty much it for me. I think we hit all the notes that I want to.
Alrighty,
Um,
well, let's move on to final impressions and James. What did you think of Ghost Trick Phantom Detective?
I don't think I've hit my opinion much this episode. I think Ghost Trick Phantom Detective is a fantastic game, even one of the best games we've done on the show. This kind of reminds me of when we did Katamari for the first time. It's just this like very isolated, short runtime experience that is has no filler, is fun from start to end, feels like a very complete package and a very unique package in, I guess, the gaming sphere. There really isn't another puzzle game like this one, which is awesome. It's really fun. Like we've done this is episode 127. So when we get to play a game with unique gameplay, it's special, right? So to me, this game is sort of like irreplaceable in that you can't really get this experience anywhere else. And animation, presentation, characters, music, it's a complete package. There really isn't a single thing in this game where I'm like, that is a huge misstep. No, like basically everything is done well, done fun, and this is one of my favorite games of the show now for sure. I think everyone should give this one a go, especially now that you can play it on phone, PC, Switch, PlayStation, whatever. It's just fantastic experience from start to finish.
So, James, I'm much less high on this game than you are, but you're pretty high on it, so don't let me over exaggerate. I think this is a very good game. I think it's worth playing for most people. I think most people will enjoy this. I just think that there is something about the design of this game and Ace Attorney, because it takes a lot of the same principles, that delivers an experience that's not really perfect for me. The core of that is that the presentation of this game takes front and center. And the presentation is very good. Don't get me wrong. Like the music is great, characters are great, aesthetics are beautiful. The story it tells is interesting. It's just that this comes at the cost of the gameplay. The intent is to wrap the story so tightly into the gameplay that they're one and the same, and I feel like that the gameplay can suffer a bit as a consequence.
Hmm.
That happens when you get this story, which is like a little bloated, a little bit repetitive in how it needs to reiterate everything clearly. It's in the fact that they're so keen to show their animations that it wrests control away from you. It comes from the fact that the puzzles don't escalate in difficulty or push their mechanics nearly as much as they possibly could because it wants to keep the story moving along. I can imagine a version of Ghost Trick's mechanics made by an indie developer that puts the mechanics front and center that create a far more compelling gameplay experience, a more complex one that you have to be a lot more invested in, one where there's more logic to the way objects move and you really have to think, where you can see a lot more on the screen at once, which I think would be better suited for me. And this game does not really deliver on that gameplay experience in a meaningful way because it's trying to tell a more holistic experience wrapped up with the story. That's all to say I don't think this game is bad. I just don't think it's the perfect game for me. And I wish someone would take these ideas and push the gameplay metric on them further. I do recommend it. You should play Ghost Trick, but you should be aware of the irritations and barriers to truly enjoying the gameplay on a deeper level that do absolutely exist, in my opinion.
I think that's fair enough. It is, yeah, there's definitely an audience for this that, like, I think the fact that Patrick isn't in the target audience for this game almost, but still thinks it's really good is a testament to the game's quality.
Well, the good stuff is so good, and this is
Yeah.
the same problem I have with Ace Attorney, right? Like when the stuff I love about Ace Attorney, I adore about Ace Attorney. No other game does what Ace Attorney does. but it's just filled with so much bloated crap that it can't help but irritate me.
I will
I
say
do
that
think
Ghost Trick doesn't have the worst thing that Ace Attorney does, which is like the point and click adventure problem of wandering around aimlessly.
I agree.
That is not present here, which I was very grateful for.
Yeah, the chunks between story and gameplay are smaller,
Yeah.
which is amazing. So you get a little chunk of story and then a little chunk of gameplay back and forth instead of Ace Attorney's big chunky story bit with no gameplay. So it moves away from the visual novel, you know, half and half presentation, which I'm very grateful. Imagine if you had to like go to the junkyard and identify all the objects in between the
So
actual good
annoying.
bits. Yeah.
I was actually early on. I mentioned I was glad it made it so. This was very early into my playthrough. I said on Discord, I'm glad that it doesn't let you go to irrelevant locations. It turns out it actually does let you do that. It's just that that specific location, the one with the obvious evil guys, actually makes a lot of sense why it's not always accessible. It took me longer to figure out, but yeah, great game. Could be better, but like it's not far off being just one of the best games ever, in my opinion.
Jesus, you're very high on this game.
Oh, I love it.
I can see why you wanted to pick it for this show. Like five years ago.
I was actually expecting to be disappointed because normally when I get excited about something ahead of time, it's never as good as I imagine it to be. This was pretty much as enjoyable as I was hoping, which was, it's always great when that happens, right?
Yeah. Now we just need to wait another 5 years to do your next favorite game. Something terrible, probably.
It's actually we have to wait till next year, and then I can force Patrick to play through Catherine, which will be that's like the big episode for me because that's like I haven't met someone who doesn't like that game yet.
I have tried to watch footage of Catherine on YouTube, and I'm like, what is even going on here? why are they? And I can kind of like grasp that there's puzzle mechanics, but I'm like, I think I need to actually play this to properly understand.
Another one that
I need the tactile feel of actually messing around with it. But it does look like it's to some degree a Sokoban kind of game, if I had to guess.
Absolutely is. Yeah. It's like a tower climbing game. It's how I would put it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, Steven Sausage Roll has already claimed the top Sokoban spot. I mean, Baba Is You as well, but Baba Is You is too hard, so I give up.
It's interesting. That game is almost too hard, but it does something.
I haven't finished it. It was too
cool,
hard.
though.
Whereas I did finish Steven's Sausage Roll after many grueling hours. So anyway, so that does it. Thank you so much for listening to our episode on Ghost Trick. We are the Retrospectives podcast. You can find all of our content on our website, which is rspodcast.net. It's got links to everything, the most important of which is our Discord server. And we would love if you have any suggestions or feedback to drop by and say hi. We've taken a lot of suggestions from our listeners, and we're always looking for more. So please do drop by. We don't care how popular a game is. We care a lot more about if that game's interesting or not. So if you have any cool suggestions, we would love to hear them. And finally, if you would like to support the show monetarily, we have a Buy Me a Coffee page. There are links to that on our website, and we'll also pop it in our show notes. So James, we are done with, I was about to say we're done with Catherine. We are done with Ghost Trick Phantom Detective. We finally played it after all these years.
What is the next game? It's your choice.
We're going to be doing a very special game, James. One that has not actually been requested, hilariously, but I feel is an important one for us to play. We're going to be playing Baldur's Gate 1, not Baldur's Gate 2.
Unfortunately. However, this is exciting because we normally don't do very long games. I'm expecting this next episode to come out late because we're going to need 40 hours as opposed to 12 hours to finish this one. But
and at this stage, like, we always like to finish the games for the show. We don't like to play half or three quarters or whatever. We like to finish them. So we're going to finish Baldur's Gate before the episode releases. And if it's a bit longer because of it, so be it.
Yeah, and I'm excited to play a CRPG that's not Fallout because honestly, I hated those games. Like, I really did not enjoy Fallout 1 and 2. So it'll be interesting to find... something with a bit more, number go up than we normally do, because that's
Well,
what makes my brain, go wild.
it's very interesting because obviously you've played a decent amount of D&D now, James. I know that you've kind of gotten into it in the past couple of years.
Yeah.
And Pathfinder, you've played a lot of the modern CRPGs, but Baldur's Gate 1 runs on second edition Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
So it's a very different beast, even though on the surface it looks kind of familiar. And a lot of mechanics that are present in the later editions are just not present. Like we were talking about flanking, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure that flanking doesn't exist. That's just not a
Yeah.
mechanic in second edition.
From what I can tell, the spell lists look pretty similar. I'm going to imagine that spell casting's just as strong as it is in real tabletop D&D, but I imagine going up to level 7 or 9 limits it a bit.
The main difference, I think, is that spellcasting in second edition, particularly, I mean, it's true in third edition as well, is that spellcasting gets stronger the later you go, and early on, it's not very strong.
Yeah.
Whereas I think it's a bit more equalized in the later editions where characters, yes, I still think spellcasters are stronger in the late game, but I don't think it's as big a gap.
I think 5e still like that. Third edition or 3.5 is definitely like after level 10 spellcasters rule the game. But it's still obscenely overpowered in 5 late game. But that's by design, right? Like, it's the power fantasy of playing this old wizard guy who has all the arcane power of the universe at his fingertips.
Well, I can tell you playing a caster at level 1 in Baldur's Gate 1 is pretty rough.
Not very fun, no, I imagine.
It's pretty rough.
Yeah, you're playing Sorcerer, right?
Yeah, I thought I'd play a sorcerer. It seems like the most fun. I like the spellcasters in D&D because you've got so many options. It probably isn't as strong as just picking a class that hits people with a stick, but I doubt the game is hard enough that it matters. I do know I have played these games a little bit when I was younger. I didn't get very far, but I have played them a bit, and I do know that you need to quick save and quick load. Iron Manning these games is for professionals. It's not for me.
Yeah, and I'm playing a rogue cleric multi-class. We'll see how that goes. I really like having melee characters that have some spells.
So yeah, we'll play Baldur's Gate 1 and maybe for one of our dear listeners eventually Baldur's Gate 2, but we figured it would be better to start with the first game. I know that you can import your character from the first game into the second as well. So, in 2032 we might play Baldur's Gate 2.
We'll see. All right. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Adios.